Welcome back to the Responsible Parent podcast, where overwhelmed families learn how to naturally regulate their nervous system. I'm your host, Kaylee Opatic, and today's episode is a part two continuation of our interview with herbalist Jim McDonald. Enjoy.
So there's a lot of good teas that you could make. So chamomile is really good tasting tea. Spearmint is both relaxing and invigorating, so that makes a good tasting tea that most people will like. You can put orange peel in things. Lemon balm tastes good. There's a lot you can do with tea, and tea's probably my preference before I start thinking about other things that aren't tinctures but go in the same kind of bottle,
Yep.
because I feel like next to a mixture of alcohol and water, the next best extractive is just water. Like
Right.
water to me is preferable to like straight vinegar used to extract herbs or straight glycerin used to extract herbs. If you're buying herbal glycerites in a store, almost all of those were extracted with alcohol and the alcohol was removed and then glycerin was used to replace it. And that's different than what you would be able to make at home.
Right.
There's a myth that a lot of people will find online or they will read in books that says if you put a squirt of tincture into your hot tea, that the heat of the tea will evaporate the alcohol off. And that just doesn't happen,
Mm.
right? You'd have to like
Huh.
boil it on your stove for quite a long time. And if you do that, what'll happen is you'll lose a bunch of the aromatics in your herb, and your chamomile will get a lot more bitter tasting and it'll go from being really good to not being so good. You can infuse chamomile into apple juice or like apple cider, and it's really spectacular. But on the whole, like if a person, it's not an ideological thing, if they just think that the very low dose of alcohol in, let's say, 5 to 15 drops of tincture might be dangerous, the cases where that would be true on a physiological level are pretty slim,
Okay.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
that's not a concern to me. I've gave herbs and tincture form to all my kids, and it wasn't something that really concerned me. But again, if something concerns you, it doesn't have to be about whether it actually is okay or not.
Right.
If you're concerned, go with that. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can make things. It doesn't have to be in a certain way. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of different ways to use herbs.
I love that. Very good. Yes. And I sent you tea. So that's something that I established, probably over a year ago when I knew I wanted to start a podcast. Was like, I want to send a tea. And I was just going to do lemon balm because for some reason that has been my favorite herb over the past like 5 years. I'm just like, lemon balm is my thing. I discovered it, didn't know it was a thing. It keeps growing, but never stops. It's not really native to anywhere, right? Like it's just kind of like an invasive herb in some way, but I don't know. I love that Shakespeare wrote about how it's known to be a cure for melancholy, and I just think that's really
Mhm.
cool. And I think my connection to it is when I first tried it from my little herb garden, I just took it fresh and then made a fresh pot of tea over it, just put boiling water over it, and I drank it. I literally was having a cruddy day. I felt like crap. And I was like, I'm going to see if this works. And I was really not expecting anything. And I drank the tea. And shortly thereafter, I was smiling. My daughter and I were having fun together. And I was like, this is incredible. I love this herb. And in addition to that, it's connected to, I think isn't its herbal name or its Latin name like Melissa? Which is connected to the Malisae, which is connected to the bee
Mhm.
queen and all these things
Yeah.
and everything woven together. I was like, this makes sense for me. And so I knew that I wanted to send out, that was a random tangent, but I knew I wanted to send out lemon balm to my guests. And I didn't know at the time that I was going to be number one, having a podcast about regulating your nervous system naturally. But then number two, having you on my podcast, a renowned herbalist, and I was sending out the tea to you, and I'm like, he's gonna be like, "This is the crappiest tea." Like, it's just the most
No,
random leaves that
I
she sent me.
I got it, and I, like, looked at the bag, and I opened it up, and I was like, "Oh, there's whole leaves in here. This is someone
Yeah,
took this and dried it and put this together, and there's lemon balm and chamomile
yeah,
and some lavender flowers,"
yeah,
is what I said. There could have been something else in there, but nothing I could look at and
yeah. Some
recognize.
catnip.
So okay, yeah.
Some catnip.
Oh, no. And those look lemon balm and catnip after they dry look really similar.
Yep. Yep. And I think, yeah, I added a little bit of peppermint too, just to, or spearmint maybe, one of the mints,
Mm,
just to spice it up.
it tastes more spearmint.
Yeah.
This is a great, example. Mint family plants grow a lot of them grow very easily. And although lemon balm grows really aggressively, at least here in Michigan, I've never been out in the forest and gone, "Oh, no, the understory is gone. It's all
Right.
lemon balm," right?
Never.
We're mostly staying out and spread with wild abandon and some peppermint, and my favorite mint is orange mint. Oh my gosh, I love orange mint
Oh, I've
as
never
a
tried
tea.
that.
It's a more like spearmint than it is like peppermint. It's just
Okay.
wonderful tasting and it's a spectacular herb. But this is just stuff you can have outside your house
Right.
and
There's
walk
a lot
out
of
and
them.
make tea with it or pick a bunch and dry it. And because they're mints, a lot of them will just grow back gangbusters.
Yep.
And that's so empowering. So
Right.
empowering. Like, oh, I can go outside and I can either just pick some herbs for a tea that I'm going to drink right now, or I can like look and be like, wow, this lemon balm is getting out of control. I'm
Absolutely.
gonna need to cut it back, but rather than cutting it back and throwing it into the compost pile, which is gonna turn your compost pile into a lemon balm grove, you can take what you cut back and hang it up to dry or put it in
Right.
a dehydrator, and then as soon as it's this is important, totally dry, not mostly dry, but totally dry, put it in a jar, and then you've got stuff for tea. And old European herbals, when they talked about lemon balm, they didn't use the word nervine like I as an herbalist and most herbalists would do nowadays. But, "Oh, lemon balm is a wonderful nervine." That's very gentle and yet quite effective. They would say, because often they would just call it balm. They'd be like, "Oh, balm gladdens the heart." And
Oh,
I'm like, "So much cooler." That's just so much cooler to
yeah.
think of things gladdening the heart. And that's totally what it does, is it's got this sort of releasing and uplifting quality to it. Plants with volatile oils that are aromatic, they're like dispersive just by nature. The volatile oils are themselves physically dispersive. When you consume them, or even if you just had some, you crush it up and inhale it. It's that stuck mental congestion and emotional congestion can help create movement. And that can be good not only for stress with a lot of anxiety, but if someone has, and I'm not talking about like clinical depression here, although there's some overlap. But if someone is feeling like, I just can't, I don't have the energy and I don't have the motivation, and what that state calls for is movement,
Movement.
right?
Yep.
And in plants that are aromatic, and it could be lemon balm, it could be holy basil, it could be St. John's wort. And these are aromatic plants that's like when people are feeling like stagnant and stuck, they create movement. They're emotional and cognitive processing.
I love that. And I'm happy that you make the connection too. That's a lot of the inner work that happens within me, but it's connecting. There's movement on several different levels, right? There's
Yeah.
movement physically, there's movement aromatically, there's movement maybe emotionally, there's movement on a cellular level. And I think it's so valid, and that makes the interconnectedness of life and of plants with us and how we are a part of nature. It just makes it all that more special and that more meaningful. And that in itself can get you unstuck as well, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. So I'll maybe make the thing because I did mention St. John's wort, right? And so
Sure.
someone out there is thinking, oh, but I've heard St. John's wort is, potentially dangerous if someone's taking certain kinds of medications. And yeah, I mean, that's a consideration, and it's an important consideration. It's not something to be like, "Ah, it's an herb, so it must be fine," or "It's a gentle herb, so it must be fine." There are some medications that St. John's wort, that what it can do is it speeds up the rate at which your body detoxifies them and gets them out of the body. So it speeds drug metabolism. Some
Okay.
people might be like, oh, that's good. The drugs are getting out of my body more quickly. But if the drug is like an immunosuppressant because you have someone else's kidney, or
Right.
the drug is an antiretroviral because someone has HIV,
You want it to
or
stay.
someone is taking birth control pills and they are also cleared through this pathway, it's a consideration. Right? You
Right.
have to think about it. That important consideration, and it's no less important because of what I'm going to say, does not though mean, oh, if you were to accidentally ingest something that had it was a tincture and a third of it was St. John's wort and you took it and you had someone else's kidney, that you're going to go into kidney rejection. Or
Right.
my gosh, I'm taking birth control pills because I have one kid and I don't want to have more kids right now, or I have X many number of kids and I don't want to have more kids right now. I took St. John's wort and now that's automatically going to be a failure. That is also not true,
Mhm.
right? In the realm of herbal interactions with drugs, or even herbal interactions during pregnancy or lactation, contraindications of don't take this if you're pregnant or if you're nursing. What a lot of people want to think exists is a list of like, these things are known to be okay, and these things are not known to be okay. And there's maybe 3 to 5% of things we could say that about. And then the rest of everything is there's a whole lot of it depends.
Yeah.
How much are you taking? How long are you using it for? What form is it in? There's just like a lot of considerations. And so as people are becoming interested in herbs and they're wanting to try stuff, that's an important consideration. What you do is you need to do some learning and some looking and see what's there to find out. If you look from conventional sources or you hear the common refrain of before you think about using this, ask your doctor's probably gonna, in most cases, know as much about herbs as I know about like how to like make a laptop work, where this Zoom call works. Like, I don't know. That's not what I do. And because of
Right.
what they do in medicine is maybe like adjacent to what we do, people will be like, oh, they'll know. And probably what they'll know is we don't really know and it's unclear. So just don't do that. If you don't do something, then you will be safe from the potential risk that you might face, but you also won't have the potential benefits. What I think as an herbalist whose lives have been taken over by plants, what I think is if you're going to use plants, take the time to learn about what you're using and how it might affect you. And when you're trying to choose resources to learn from, consider lots of resources, but definitely make sure that the resources that you're turning to have at least some understanding of herbs.
Right.
Because if you're getting all of your information from someone who knows a lot about herbs, but has never actually touched or smelled or tasted or used a plant ever, that would be like asking someone to fix your brakes who Googled a lot about it, but has never fixed brakes before.
Right.
So there are lots of herbalists in this country and in the English speaking world. People out there might speak other languages, but I am in the English speaking world. And so that's what I know, who are skilled, who have extensive experience using herbs themselves. So they have like firsthand understanding of what to expect. And those are the people that will be able to say, "Oh, yes, I know this is a consideration," but when you're thinking about the fact that you read, don't take like, you oh, should I do this? Should I do this? Should I do
Ah,
this? Yeah. Trying to figure out, like, what's okay to take when you're nursing, and then you
yeah.
go to the site that a lot of parents will go to, the Kelly Mom site, and it'll say, "Oh, you can take nettle if you're nursing, but you can't take stinging nettle because it'll dry up your milk." And it's, "Wait a minute. That's the same those are the same
The
plant. Those
same thing.
are and the reason that mistake is there because whoever wrote that article doesn't know what they're talking about. They just
Right.
Googled, they found some contradictory information using different names, and they thought that they were different plants, and so that's what they said. And if someone doesn't know about something, they won't be able to spot, like, the flaws in the reasoning that might be there. Even if we don't always say the only people we should ever learn about herbs from are herbalists. We should always have herbalists involved in our learning about herbs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. And it's also a really good segue to bring things full circle because I mentioned at the beginning I wanted to come to this. So this is a perfect segue. When you sent me your full bio, you had mentioned that your entire life changed back in what was it, 94, you said, when you
Oh,
drank
yeah.
tea from a wild plant harvested on your land. So I would love to know a little bit more about that story.
I
How
was
did you
in
become an
college.
herbalist? Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was in college. I was not really interested notably in plants. I was not notably interested in health because I was like 20 something and doing fine.
You're like, "Burgers are
Um,
great."
and I moved on to a piece of property in Okemos, Michigan, outside of the East Lansing area where I was going to school. And it was like an old overgrown farm. And so there was like swamps and woods and fields. And my friend Jason left out our book, and I started like flipping through it, and it was engaging enough to draw my attention. And at the same time, I was walking back and forth past the Beale Botanical Gardens, and I'd be like, "Oh, that's the plant that grows next to the front porch," and "Oh, that's the plant that grows." There's little signs that say what they are. Oh, there's this, that, and the other. And I would go and I would look them up in the book. And one of the plants growing next to the barn was burdock. And I read in the book, I was like, this plant seems like it's good for everything. I went out with a little trowel, your average garden trowel that might be like what, 6 inches
Mhm.
ish. And I started digging up the root, and I kept digging and I kept digging because burdock roots have like a taproot, like a carrot, except it can be like over 2 feet long. So this one was over 2 feet long. And so 20 minutes later, there's this huge hole, and the root is still big and it's still like going down into the ground. I'm like, oh my gosh, what in the world? Eventually got most of it out. I get the bottom of it cracked, as happens when you dig burdock root. And I took it inside. And I rinsed it off and I chopped it up and I poured tea. I didn't dry it first. I just poured water over it and I made tea. And as soon as it wasn't going to burn my tongue, I drank it and I like waited for something to happen. And burdock is, in a lot of the world, it's just a vegetable, right? Like it's just a food. And here, because we don't eat it as a vegetable, we say it's a medicinal herb.
Sure.
But it's mostly just a vegetable that is really nutritious and helps your body function better. And it's hard to tell whether the quote unquote medicinal actions are from the burdock or the fact that your body's working more effectively because of the support that it gives you and the nutrition that it has. So it's not the kind of thing you drink a cup of tea and you notice something.
Right.
If I make skullcap tea or hops tea, I'll feel tired. If I make chamomile tea, I'll feel relaxed. If I make spearmint tea, I'll feel decongested. And this I just drank and I was just like, huh, I don't think I can tell anything is happening. And now what I think is what happened from that first cup of tea is everything since, because that was the first plant that I went out and dug up and processed with my hands. And the reason I am at in my decades long wondering.
Mm.
Wondering is a state of inquiry and wondering is a state of awe with plants is because I just haven't stopped. Like it is still just as magical and amazing to me now as it was then. I still feel like there's just as much to learn now as I did then, even though I've learned a lot more. There's so many plants and there's so many traditions and people are so unique. Um, and even some of the herbs I started learning about 30 years ago, I'm still learning new things about. So like that to me is okay, it's super cool. It's an unending field of study. Huh?
That is super cool. And burdock is definitely one of those herbs that any like Midwest or Michigan herbal book that I have, foraging, whatever, burdock's always listed, right? It's
Mhm.
like number one, easiest to access. I've actually found I haven't because I haven't ever found a safe and like clean space for me
Yeah.
to wildcraft it from because it loves growing on the edge of fields that are likely just full of chemicals and nasty drain up or along roadsides or like railroad tracks where you have to worry about all the toxins.
Yeah.
And yeah, have you found besides the location you initially wildcrafted it from, have you found like a is there a money spot where you're like, yeah, if you go to some sort of reservoir or whatever. I don't know. Do you have a good spot?
So burdock likes to grow in areas that have been disturbed, right? And so it, one way that you can think about this, and you want to get permission when you're going to collect something on property that isn't yours.
Right.
That is ideal. But if I had a farm that I was growing everything completely conventionally, I wanted it to be an organic farm. I think it used to be, at least, that in 3 years I can go from a conventional farm to an organic farm, right? So maybe if you know of an area nearby you that has been a neglected field for longer than 3 years, so it could be considered organic now. And then you see just things I watch for. Oh, a development sign, like development proposed.
Mhm.
What I will do then is I'm like, oh, that sign is an invitation for me to go and check it out because maybe I want to buy that land.
Sure.
And then I'll walk around and I'll see what's there. And if I see in the field, oh, there's some burdock. It's a non-native plant. It's very sustainable to gather. It's super weedy here in Michigan. Don't use a hand trowel. You can get something called a drain shovel, which is long and narrow to dig it up. That's what I prefer to use when digging it. And that's what I would shoot for. Or maybe better is if you know of any like organic farms or CSAs in your area and you contact them and say, do you have any burdock growing there?
Yeah.
Chances are they do. And if they have it growing there, and especially if it's growing in their like super cushy organic and it's loose soil, it's going to be really wonderful eating burdock.
Mhm.
If it's going to have all of everything that it needs to grow big and fat and juicy and flavorful is like right there. If something's growing in a neglected field, it usually won't be as big and fat and juicy, and it'll be flavorful, but the flavor will be swung in a different direction.
Mm.
Burdock, it's like not sweet like sugar, but it's got like a sweet starchy flavor and maybe swung in the direction of like slightly in like maybe with hints of sesame. So
And
it's kind of bland with a little bit of sesame, starchy, and you can chop it up and eat it just like carrots, or mix it with carrots, add it to soups, add it to stir fries. You can pickle it, you can cook it, you can eat it raw. There's just so many ways to use burdock. I'll add it into bone broths that I make or put it into stir fries. It's a really wonderful plant to learn. Different parts of the plant can be eaten. The leaves are really bitter. And I love bitter things. I could go on and on for a whole other podcast about why bitter things are awesome and really important in your diet, even if they're unfamiliar to a lot of people. But burdock leaf bitter is not my flavor of bitter that I'm like, oh yeah, I love that. I'm like dandelion leaf are bitters that taste good, and burdock leaves are bitters that I'm like, no, I'm going to use those for something else.
yeah.
You can peel the leaf stems or peel the stems when the stem comes up to get that outer skin off of it. And then that will remove a bunch of the bitterness. And then that ends up being really good. But if someone's really interested in foraging for edible foods, you can't do better in this region than looking for books by Sam Thayer. Um, Samuel Thayer is just, his stuff is amazing. He's a great guy. He's super knowledgeable. And I find his books like really solid and written from what I do, written from a lot of experience. He's not passing on stuff that he does not himself know to be true.
Well, that's great. I'll look up some of his information and put it in as a link in our bio to this podcast. So that sounds good. That's wonderful. Thank you. So, what was I going to say? I was going to wrap around to I'm talking about the burdock. Oh, yummy food, super nutritionist or super nutritional. I'm looking forward to now. I'm
Yeah.
going to be looking for development signs in my area.
Yes,
I
yes.
didn't even think about that.
If I do that, first of all, I want to see, oh, that's a field that's been there for a long time.
Mm,
And then, so I know it's been like years that
yeah,
nothing's been going on.
yeah.
I want to think about like, how close is it to the road? How busy is the road? I want to think about, is it uphill or downhill from a road?
Mhm.
Is it wet? Is water going from the road into that field? So like uphill from a road, I feel like I can be a little bit closer to the road. Downhill from the road, I feel like I need to be farther from the road.
Right.
Sometimes I've read books where they're like this many feet or this many yards, and I never do that. I just go and I think like, how much stuff is leaking on that road, and is
Right.
it probably getting to where I'm standing or where this plant is at. The other thing I'll do is I'll walk around and I'll look for things like, do I see a bunch of trash? You
Right.
know, just so there can be a field that's been a field for like 15 years, but if it's been the field everyone's been dumping in and there's buckets all over the place, that's not a good place.
Right.
Sometimes I'll dig down into the soil. Just do I see worms? Do I see bugs? Or do I see
Right.
nothing? One time I did this. This is actually on a field that went up for development. Exactly everything I said. And I was like, oh, I'm going to check out this field. There was a ton of mullein growing there. And I dug into the ground and I was like, in the world? And evidently, who knows how many years before, someone must have put like huge ground cloth tarps over the whole field, thinking that it was going to act as a weed barrier. And all the plants just grow up through it. But everywhere I put my shovel down, there was like when a tarp frays into all those tiny little strands of plastic,
Yeah.
that was just all mixed into all of the soil. And so even though it looked great, after I walked around and dug around a little bit, I'm like, no, this is not where I'm going to gather plants.
Just ton of microplastics.
Lots of yes.
Chock full of them. Oh man, that's a whole nother podcast episode, right? But to that point as well, so once I do air this podcast episode, if some of the listeners come back and say, "Hey, I really love this, but you didn't touch on X, Y, and Z," would you be open to coming on and answering other like more specific questions?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Absolutely. I know. I feel like we could talk about herbs forever. I'll
Well, I
definitely be
know.
attending another one of your classes, so I'll come listen to you talk about herbs. So,
I, I was talking to someone and we were talking about teaching, and they said something like, oh, I'm not like you. I get nervous when I teach. And I
oh,
was like, I can get nervous too. And they're like,
right.
you don't get nervous. I'm like, no, I can get nervous. And they're like, what makes you nervous? And I'm like, if someone says I only have a very small, limited
Yeah.
time, to teach, and when you contacted me, and we're going to try to keep this like a 45 minutes, I was like, oh, that's the kind of thing
Yeah.
as being someone who like tells stories and wants to get into like fleshing out details.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh,
we can just do more rather than one short thing and feel like it didn't get into the details.
absolutely.
The fine details, or what I like to say is the nuance. That's the kind of understanding with
Right.
plants that you want to have is you want to have the nuance. Like, oh, it's not just that like skullcap is good for anxiety and stress. It's, oh, skullcap is a bitter herb that is really good as an relaxant antispasmodic and especially helpful if someone's responding to stress with like irritability and anger and frustration and little like explosions and tantrums, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that someone has to have all of those things, but that is like the very fine detail of if you see that presentation, oh, that's probably the herb that I want to think about using.
Absolutely. I love that. Well, to that point, we are running out of time. not to get not to give you anxiety again. No, but
Yeah.
I would like to get to the point of our conversation where I ask my guests to share a story of when you realized that being responsible was something other than what you had been raised to think it was. And so this can be related to our talk about herbalism, but certainly doesn't have to be.
That's a that's becoming a parent, right?
Yeah.
Because I've said, and it's a joke, but it's true, like, I'm not responsible enough to be a parent. Like, when did I ever put out there, "Oh, yes, I'm so responsible that I would like to take responsibility for keeping, like, small babies alive." That's, like, huge, but when, I think, like, of responsibility is, like, when you find yourself in the situation, how do you handle yourself? How do you rise to the occasion of the situation that you're in? And
Right.
so for me, if I think about responsibility, it's not something where, oh, there's a person and they're very responsible, or there's a person they are not responsible. I know we could think of examples of people like that, but I think that for a lot of us who fall in that middle ground where we're responsible about some things, those other things, it really comes down to, oh, in this moment that I'm in this situation that I'm in, what do I really need to do so that I can be a good human,
Right.
right? So that I'm not shirking something that makes someone else's life or momentary situation.
Mhm.
A lot more difficult than it needs to be when I could do something that wouldn't be quite as hard for me. And then to relate it to plants, it is the most important things surrounding responsibility is if you're gathering wild plants, it is just as important as identifying them to gather them in a responsible and ethical way so that you're not threatening or endangering or harming those plants in their populations out in the wild because they're not just here for us to use, they're here to exist for their own reasons.
Right.
And then if you are a person who is making suggestions to other people, is being responsible to say, I don't know, or that is beyond the scope of my understanding, or I know a lot about this, but I don't know about that other thing. I just don't have the answer because what we don't want to do is in our fear to not know and then make you feel inadequate, give someone information that's incorrect or doesn't have important information that we don't know that they need.
Sure. Absolutely. And another layer to that too, I feel is that your origin story of becoming an herbalist is really that of you're in college doing the responsible thing, right? And then you found herbalism, which to most probably at the time was rather seemed to be irresponsible, right? But you knew that if you follow that curiosity, it's very responsible in your heart of you to help
Uh,
yourself and help people with it and to make that
yeah.
connection between humans and the land, and feel like that in itself is what we're all about.
Mm. To be really honest, I was sometimes in college. There there were definitely times I was supposed to be in college, and instead I was out in a meadow somewhere.
I love that. Then it chose you.
Yeah, that's definitely what it was, is I sometimes think people are like, "When did you decide to become an herbalist?" I'm like, "I didn't decide to become an herbalist. It just happened around me."
Yeah.
There was a point where someone said, "Oh, are you an herbalist?" And I just objectively thought about it, and I was like, "It would be silly to say no."
Right.
I go out, I pick plants, I make things with them, I use them to help people, I use them to help myself and my family. If I'm not an herbalist, like, what would I call myself? An herbalist doesn't need to be like, I'm an herbalist and therefore I can tell people how to like resolve their heart condition or cure their cancer or do this and that. An herbalist is just someone who like uses plants to help themselves and their community and their family and the world around them. And so, yeah, there's just different grades of herbalists. There's beginner herbalists and family herbalists, and there's community herbalists, and there's clinical herbalists, and none of them are better than another. You know, a clinical herbalist is not better than like a parent taking care of their children when they have a fever,
Sure.
doing different things.
Absolutely. Yep. Figuring out what works best for everybody.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's a great note to end it on. And if some families, whether they are here in Michigan or someplace else, are looking to get a hold of you and to either attend one of your virtual or in person workshops, or maybe even use some of do you do like herbalist consultations, like one on one consultations as well? Or what would be the best way
I
for people to work with you?
So the best way for people to contact me is to go online, and my website is herbcraft.org. And that has most of the information and tons of free articles and links galore. There's like hundreds of pages of written stuff there. There is also, if they're interested in online classes, there's herbcraft.podia, PODIA.com, which has all of the online classes. Eventually that will get merged in the herbcraft.org, but we're still in the process of remaking the website to have them all be under one URL. And then if people are on Facebook, I there and comment on there and put stuff out there. I'm a little bit on Instagram, but there's a little bit less interaction there. People like post stuff and then there's not so much back and forth. I like back and forth, but I have stuff there. So you can look for me on the social media thing, and it's either going to be Jim McDonald Herbalist, or on some of the things it's like herb.craft because someone had already got the herb craft before I did.
Perfect.
Um, but if you just Google Jim McDonald Herbalist,
Mhm.
I will pop up. You will find ways to find me. And if you can come out to a walk that I'm doing somewhere, I do lots of plant walks. And although I love classes like the one that you were at, where I'm in and I'm really diving deep into a specific subject, There's just nothing like being out in the woods or in a field or in a weedy lawn and being like, oh, look at this. Oh, look at that.
Right.
Oh, look at that. That never gets old.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. I'll definitely be coming to one of your herb walks soon, probably this summer, or maybe even in the fall. I'm really looking forward to understanding more about some of the fall herbs and the roots that we have native here. Looking forward to that. Thank you for all of this information and all of your time. And I'll make sure that I put all of that information in the show notes for anybody who's interested. They can just have a link ready for you. And in general, if you're listening or watching this podcast as well, I invite you to kindly subscribe, rate, and leave a review to encourage the work that we're doing here, and to share. Please share this with anybody you think this information would be valuable for. And Jim, I just want to say again, thank you. And I am so grateful that we are connected.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks for the tea.
You're welcome.